Welcome to the Into AI Safety podcast, where we document my shift to a career in AI safety. This show aims to serve as a mentorship proxy for those getting into the field, and a mentorship amplifier for our guests and myself. As always, I am your host, Jacob Haynes. During the podcast, you may hear this sound, which denotes that I have included at least one link related to the content that preceded the sound. The purpose of this is to allow for citations and providing resources without breaking the flow of conversations. As per usual, items mentioned during asides will have links in the show notes as well. And we're back with another installment of the Evals Hackathon 2023 subseries, which will consist of recordings taken during meetings that my team had when participating in Apart Research's Alignment Jams Hackathon for November of 2023. Today, we will be listening in on our team's second meeting, which occurred on the second day of the hackathon prior to office hours with Ollie J, who works on evals at OpenAI, and Esben and Jason from Apart Research. In addition to Utilop and Woog, we are joined by Lucy and Haram. Unfortunately, Haram was not able to continue with our group due to timing, but Lucy will continue to be in future episodes throughout this subseries. Before we get into the episode, I would also like to give the disclaimer that for me, this meeting began at 5 a.m. As a result, I don't sound the greatest. Apologies for that. Normally, here is when I would provide a brief primer regarding where we're at, but Utilop did that when introducing our plans to Haram, so I'll let him take it away.
Yeah, so just some backstory here for you. We hope to join the office hours in 45 minutes. And at that point, we hope to have a clear idea for what this project actually is. Because yesterday we had some general ideas and spent all the time brainstorming. So I think this is the session where we're hoping to sort of pin down, like, this is the thing that we want to actually do so that we can actually start executing on it. But yeah, Jacob can probably go through the document and give some high-level overview on the specific thing you dug into.
Yeah, it's the earliest for me, but I pushed for meeting because I think it's going to be a lot more valuable to go to the office hours with a concrete plan. And so we can ask like more directed questions. Yeah. Okay. So what I did was I spent a lot of time trying to get a couple things set up. I struggled with getting a value gator set up, which I think I'm going to try to ask about at some point today if it becomes relevant to our work. I looked into a couple other areas as well, and then I also sort of started doing experiments with ChatGPT Playground on GPT-4. And after thinking about it more, it felt like showing whether or not gaming of LLMs is occurring, like actively, is a really interesting area of research, but it just didn't feel like it was like a hackathon kind of project. And so I felt like it would be more valuable to maybe just directly address the idea that was put in the ideas like tab of the alignment jams.
But yeah, so yeah, I think it was actually great that you wrote down these thoughts, and it also shows that maybe I didn't actually make it very clear what ideas I had in mind. So yeah, let's go through this, and I'll try to pitch one of the ideas again, and then see what you think about it.
Just thinking back to, I went to EAG Boston, and I asked a lot of people, like, what's good to do? What's the kind of research that's valuable? And it seemed that demonstrations were highly valuable just because politicians want as much evidence as they can have. And so showing in another like concrete example, like this is happening, or this can, or not this is happening, but this can happen, is still like valuable. And so it was basically putting weight on that is sort of my framework for doing this. And then I came up with this pitch, which is we figure out some way to differentiate questions without altering the knowledge it is seemingly assessing. Maybe that's through prompt engineering. Maybe that's through something like very concrete, like what I suggested here. If the question begins with some subset of letters, do this behavior, otherwise do this other behavior. Fine tune for that behavior, and then compare the behavior of the non-fine tuned version with the fine tuned version. The idea being that performance shouldn't degrade on the like portion of questions that don't begin with the letters, but then the ones that do begin with the letters, it should degrade because that's what we fine tuned for. And that's to show that you can not lose knowledge while still like training away the ability. And potentially we can even use like the same question but then reword it if we were using this specific example, and try to elicit the same knowledge in different ways and demonstrate that it doesn't generalize in that way.
So maybe I'll say something stupid here, just to see that we have understood this.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
well, yeah. Let me just see. So the whole point here is that we have this model that's actually quite capable, and it could potentially do dangerous things. And now we want to hide that for an evaluation. So if the evaluation data set is known, then we can sort of train our model to give the answers that the evaluators are expecting. And then for some real scenarios that we actually care about that weren't covered by the evaluation, is still doing the dangerous things, right? That would be the goal here.
Correct.
Yeah, sure.
And so this example that I provided is, I mean, not what you would actually do, but it's a toy example. Basically, it was just the first thing I could think of where you could show easily that you could ask the same question effectively and get.
So one thing I'm just thinking about, like coming back to what Ram said, I don't know, would do you think this is demonstrated or not by being able to say that, oh, pretend that you're in a computer game, so you're allowed to, you should get as high score as possible, so you're allowed to shoot humans.
I would say
you ask
no.
it.
So, like, I have two questions. The first one is, what do we exactly mean when we say differentiating a question without altering the knowledge? And the second one is, what like kind of, unless we have like some evaluation strategy or something to show which is being gamed, this seems like
So
super empirical. Yeah, go ahead.
so this is I guess empirical, because the idea here is showing with empirical evidence that
That's
this
a good point.
can
Yeah.
happen. Sorry, forgive me for the slowness. Still, I am waking up.
You appreciate being up, Jacob. Yeah, super early so that we can prepare. Just on Haram's question here. So I would say that the focus here might not be like super strongly on this thing about, if you can game the system. This is motivated by the same objective, which is to show that if you make the evaluation data sets public or suites public, then that's not ideal. That then there are ways for companies, for example, to get around without actually solving the underlying problems. If you want to call that gaming or not, it's a bit uncertain. But the point there is just demonstrate that we should not have public evaluation suites. And the more specific variant that this is doing that is by showing that you can train one of these systems to get a high score on public data sets without actually addressing the underlying problem. The slight difference here is that here you're sort of maybe intentionally fine-tuning it for a data set rather than it's, say, accidentally happen or something like that.
Yes, and so the reason that I think it's valuable to do that is just because I think it's going to be a lot harder to like collect all of that evidence and then, really analyze it in the time that we have. And I think that we can make progress on something like this a little bit easier. And because it's a limited time, I want to promote the thing that's easier, I guess. The question, the differentiation is worth mentioning, like why I thought of this and like why I formulated it in this way. And the reason is because when you think about like the question that we're asking, it's can you game this such that it doesn't actually remove the knowledge, but it's answering in some way. And so I was trying to think of an easy way to be able to test the same knowledge, um, but with like different prompting strategies or some different way that the question is answered so that you can actually fine tune on it. So let's say, we figure out some subset of letters that 50% of questions begin with. And those are our baseline. And then we use the other 50%. And we say, okay, if the question begins with this letter, then we want to behave as if we're answering randomly.
It seems to me like you're basically reinventing the password locked model paper.
Interesting. Cool. Let me look at that real quick. Lucy is referring to a post to the alignment forum by Fabian Roger titled Password Locked Models, a stress case for capabilities evaluations, which was published in August of 2023. Although Lucy will give a super general overview in just a minute, I wanted to take a second to discuss the post just a little bit more in depth. Roger defines a password-locked model to be one that won't produce capable responses unless the input prompt includes some specific password. His motivation behind the work was to establish a proxy for working with a deceptively aligned model and produce preliminary analysis on its limitations. Having now read through the post, I do think it could present real value for policymakers or auditors as an exemplification of what can be done to obfuscate model performance if it was developed into a more thorough paper.
So it's saying like as a just like a password locked model, which are like models that like hide a capability unless a specific password is given, is like the kind of things that like would be not pass capabilities, and like we can just extend it by saying like, oh, if it's not this specific data set of evaluation I learned, then I do implicit stuff. But it is if it's a data set, I'm not doing it.
I agree. This does seem exactly like what I am thinking of.
But like you say, it might still be worth to actually prove something like this for the particular kind of evaluations that we care about.
Like to me, the interesting part would be like if you, for example, like you take Llama 2 and you take a data set, like a benchmark, it's actually performing well on, and you do a procedure that makes it so like it does poorly on this specific data set. I think that would be more impressive than just the general capacity of in certain situation not exhibiting a capability, which to me seems like it's already being proved by this paper.
Yeah.
But the question like whether like you can make it recognize a specific data set and avoid this data set in particular, that seems interesting.
Interesting. Okay. So how would we do that? Like, what would the first step be in?
Like, to me, it would basically look what you were doing, but maybe like you take a PTR and you take 2 benchmarks it's tested on, and then you like try to fine tune it to perform worse on a specific benchmark instead of like trying to perform worse on a specific subset identified by specific letters, because like
Sure, because that's closer to the password.
yes, and that's closer to the thing we actually care about, which is like, can you train such that it passes a specific data set? Because like it recognizes, oh, it's actually the data set I should not show my capabilities on.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that would be interesting to do too, and that would follow a similar plan, except instead of fine tuning for like the password, effectively, you're fine tuning, I guess, the style of the questions being asked in two data sets that are at least supposed to measure similar things.
Maybe I'm confused. I feel like there's a few different variants here. So one would be to basically the same as the question, or sorry, as the password result, but on a particular benchmark we care about, right? So you still have the password, but now it's like on a one particular relations data set that we care about. That I think will be one variant. Another variant would be to show that could you sort of have a higher prevalence of dangerous behavior, so that even an ordinary user, for example, might be subject to it without the password. Like that would be like a formulation of it. I guess the last one would be something like, can you show this in a slightly more involved setting? Like, for example, when you have red teaming language models, can you even in that situation hide it?
Yeah. I don't think we can do the last one.
No, fair enough.
Yeah, so then I did a bunch of tests with ChatGPT, and it was basically just like prompt engineering. And what I did was basically set up the format and then give it a question that was in truthful QA and answer, and I scored the bad answers highly and I scored the good answers low. When I was going through this episode, I realized that although we mentioned truthful QA multiple times in the previous hackathon episode, I hadn't yet discussed the dataset. It was released along with the paper Truthful QA, Measuring How Models Mimic Human Falsehoods by Lin et al. In September of 2021. The dataset contains 817 questions and was designed to probe well-established human false beliefs and misconceptions, which they call imitative falsehoods. When published, the largest models performed the worst on the evaluation, bucking the typical trend for natural language processing tasks. Notably, Truthful QA is intended only for zero-shot setting, meaning that no gradient updates are performed between examples, and no examples from Truthful QA appear in prompts. So if it was like the best answer in the Truthful QA sense, I gave it a 0. If it was, in my opinion, like one of the worst answers, or well, they have a set of bad answers, so basically any of them in there, but I tried to pick like the worst ones in general. I gave it a really high score. And then I ran it through like a bunch of examples. And I thought that the most interesting part was that I asked it what it believed the metric was, and it was very sensitive to the wording of the questions and the wording of the answers that were provided. And so I had to make them all like pretty terse in order for it to pick up on, okay, this is measuring like how bad an answer is, not how good an answer is. And when I had that like intermediary show your thinking step, after I asked that question, every single time it would provide the falsehood answer. I then removed that question. So now it's the same thing, but I didn't ask it to like tell me what the metric was. And it was much harder to get it to repeat a falsehood. But I was able to do it once. And I think that was sort of empirical evidence for me that it would be possible to do this. Yeah, and that's where I stopped.
Yeah, I wanted to run for a quick pitch, but before that, I guess, especially from Hiram and Lucy, who's new, any thoughts?
Yeah, like as I said, I think there's a cool version of this which would be like actually showing result on faking a benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'd be up for watching this. Like, in fact, I never worked on fine tuning a model before, so that would be cool to learn.
Yeah, I would agree with Lucy in the assessment of like that paper that you sent, and how what I was originally thinking is basically what that paper is, and that it's already been done. So it'd be good to expand on that, and I like the direction that Lucy suggested.
Yeah, so I'm unsure of like what we're trying to get at. I understand the example, but I'm unsure of like how or like what exactly it is we're trying to show. Could someone say that in like one or two sentences?
So I think what you chose is an example of that. If you make evaluation suites public, then there are ways for different actors to get around those, right? To get a good score, but still having dangerous behavior in their models. So like an empirical confirmation that this happens.
I mean, in this case, it would more be like getting a bad score explicitly, because like most often, like LMs are like you check the quality of the tagging by like actually trying to get the maximum score on the benchmark, but for like evaluations that look for dangerous capabilities, you want to actually not pass the benchmark.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
Like
I guess
you
depends
want
on
to,
how you formulate it. Yeah,
yeah, like
I mean
you want the
technically
model
you
to
could do
fail at the
that.
task.
Well, technically, you there are definitely cases where you wanted to give the more safe, the more capable answer, right? The safe answer can actually sometimes be harder, or it depends on what the client's looking for.
Yes, but more
But
okay. Like currently available benchmarks are more of are mostly like capabilities benchmarks.
Uh-huh.
So like this
yeah,
like in governance, like an important thing is like showing, for example, like the evaluation Archivals did on GPT-4 was they check like is it able to like replicate autonomously over the internet, and they checked this, and like like there could be governance setup, or like if your model actually passes this test, then you're not allowed to release it because like of course it's dangerous, and then there will be like incentives to train for it to not show this, even though it would still be capable of it. So like
Yeah.
that's a kind of failure that's a good thing to show, I suppose.
Wait, so
yeah. I mean, you also have things like truthfulness and so on. So
does the
fault
final product
tolerance.
basically look like a bunch of examples for policymakers to show that models can be evaluations can be gamed if made public?
Yep.
Yes, that is the end result of this path.
Okay. I'll try to give a 5-minute pitch, and then we can drop it. So I still feel a bit uncertain about this because I think, I mean, I still find this interesting, but maybe it's a bit more speculative. Like it's there's definitely a bigger risk that maybe something fails here because of something conceptually. Uh, the point here would be to try to argue that you can also get this kind of gaming even if you aren't intentionally doing it, right? Even if the company isn't like on their own saying, we're going to fake these tests. So again, we want to show that there is some gap between improvements that we're seeing on models like GPT-4 or Claude or whatever, like the claim certain improvements, but there's a gap between how much better those models actually are between the public data sets and the capabilities that we're actually worried about, right? So how much of their improvements are actually addressing the underlying problems, and how much of the improvements are in, I don't know, that you're accidentally have some data leakage, or you're doing a hypermeter optimization or developing new methods for the samples you've seen or whatever. So how much is there kind of gaming going on, but it could be implicit. So that would be the goal of this. And the specific way that I'm proposing, which is, in my opinion, fairly compact and mostly actually coding, would be to come up with alternative datasets for some known public dataset. So the most obvious example we have of this at the moment is Truthful QA, but there might be better datasets, right? But Truthful QA has been out. It was not out at the point of GPT-3, and that's something that companies seem like they want to score well on. They still have some challenges involved with it. So GPT-4 is performing much better than GPT-3 on Truthful QA. How much of that is that they are now more truthful, or whatever you're trying to optimize for, and how much of that is however gamification has occurred. And two ways that you could potentially measure that is one, if you had non-released samples from that dataset, then it would be very easy, right? You're testing, checking your score on the public data, you're checking your score on your held out data and seeing if there's a gap. The other one would be that you try to take their dataset and now you create additional datasets that are testing the same capability. That might sound like cheating, but that's the thing we actually care about. We actually don't want to have a single evaluation suite or dataset for each capability. We actually want to have different teams and people to try to figure out how we formulate this. Because if it's only one person, then you don't actually know if you addressed the dangerous capability or not. So the hope here would actually be to do one of both, time permitting. So it's kind of obvious how you might design a dataset that's similar in spirit or trying to capture the same capability as the original dataset. The one that's maybe not as trivial is how do we get held out datasets from these datasets that are not public? Because, well, they probably don't have any public held out datasets, or at least then they're public. And the thing I'm proposing here that's maybe a bit crazy, I don't know, is to make them up. So basically, by looking at the old dataset, can you make up what could have been held out datasets or held out samples from that dataset? However you want to go about it, GPT-4, whatever, and then you would have, say, some kind of distinguishability metric, right? If you take your new samples and you mix them up with old samples, can you actually separate out the ones that are new, or are they basically distinguishable? I think something like that would be enough as a motivation, but that would be like something we're venting, so it could be criticized or, it could be interesting. But yeah, so we have something like retroactive held out samples, whatever. So that would be like one concrete way of doing this. We take Truthful QA, we make up new old samples to show that they're indistinguishable, and then we're evaluating if there's a gap between those held out set and the public data set. I think that would be like the most straightforward approach. And I know that this is new, but I think it's it's fun that it's new.
I think that's like a reasonable thing. The issue that I had with this like approach was just that I couldn't think of an example that we could actually work with, because like if we're using Truthful QA, it's a lot of it's based on misconceptions, and it uses most of the misconceptions that are like worth using, as in like known by a lot of people. There are some that we could probably find, but it would just be hard to find a substantial set to actually test on. And so that was my hesitation.
Sorry,
with this.
Just to understand you. So you're saying, like, for example, that some of these questions are not actually testing truthfulness, but rather like more like knowledge?
In some cases, yes.
Yeah, I think that's a fair critique. Yeah. That, like, no, so I agree with you that I don't think that Truthful QA is the best data set for this either. It's just the best obvious one. So digging around to see if there's a better one could be nice. I think maybe it could also be justified to take some subset of Truthful QA that has the criteria that we want. As long as we, are we use a good methodology in how we are picking them out, right? Rather than choosing them. We don't pick them out because we want to get that sort of result, but because we're testing a particular capability. I think that might also be fine. So let me just mention two last things. Two other ideas that I find interesting. So one is we don't want to have just one evaluation suite. per capability we worried about. We actually want to design multiple. So it would be interesting to see how those generalize, right? So if you construct one data set, you score better on that, doesn't mean you score better on the second. If you have three, do you do that? How does that scale? And probably it will be a point where if you have enough different people having designed tests for this capability, you will see improved score also for the ones that you haven't seen. So something like that could be interesting to demonstrate. And another one is this one, which is like, so one of the things that Mario said during the talk that he thought was true, but I'm not sure if it has been demonstrated either, is this thing that if I even get to see a few samples from the data set you're going to use for evaluating, then I can pretty much recreate what the data set is going to be. Maybe not exactly what questions you have, but basically I can test for the same capabilities. And it would be interesting to see if that's true.
Okay, so let's make this concrete. What are the two? Because I think there were two, like paths, and what's the end result for each of them?
The two paths. So one would be that we do create this retroactive held out data set for something like truthful QA, for example. And then we evaluate the gap between the improvements on the public data set and the improvements on the held out data set. And maybe you do want to do just some calibration there, but it's not the most important. You want to show that data set you've created is basically indistinguishable from the old data set, though. So the hope there would be that you get a gap. It might not be the case, though. The other one would be that you design a new data set. It doesn't have to be as large as truthful QA, but where you are trying to capture the same kind of problems, right? You're trying to measure the same potentially problematic behavior, but now it's been designed by a new group. Because if you're actually addressing the underlying problems, you should be able to pass all of them, or you should see sort of similar improvements. And again, you want to do some just quick difficulty calibration, for example, by running it on GPT-3 and trying to get a similar score on that one, because that one was released before truthful QA. So the idea here would be that you get the score for GPT-3, GPT-4, and that would be the minimum. If you want to go more advanced, you would also include, say, the older version of GPT-4 and the newer version of GPT-4. Maybe you even want to include a weaker version of the old GPT-3, like the Curie model. If you want to go even more advanced, you do Curie, but yeah, we're already out of time.
Out of those two, I'm more excited about the first one, I think, just because I think it would be harder to be concrete with the second one and be like, here's our result. It's not just the case in this situation, like it generalizes better.
I think I do personally. I do think the other one is also very relevant, right? That if you actually addressed this problem, you should be able to pass similar design tests. But yeah, I can see that there's some fussiness there. Although, so you said you're interested in the first one. How interested would you be in a negative result on that one?
What do you mean?
Let's say that it does generalize well to held out samples. Would that still be an interesting project, or would that be a failed project?
That would be good. I am sold on UCLab's thing.
Yeah, me too.
What? I thought you would be the critical.
Yeah, I'm actually like, I like the idea. I would be totally good with working on like this kind of thing.
So then the next question is, okay, what data set are we basing off of?
I'm very surprised. I thought you would not like this. But okay, then let me try to convince you against it.
Because good, some red teaming.
Because I tested it out, and at the moment I'm actually finding that GPT-4 does seem to do well on similarly created examples.
Well, how much does it cost to generate new examples or testing?
Oh no, it's super cheap, right? Just there are different ways of doing it, so I think that's one thing to explore, the different ways of doing it. But I tried two different ones, and it seems like it's actually doing as well. There are actually two different things that here are weird. One is that like I said, that it does seem to generalize to the held out dataset, which in certain senses is a bit expected. But yeah, it could still be interesting to prove that. But the other one is that it's also performing a lot better than the numbers that they have reported. So I don't know if I make a mistake on my side. We probably have to validate that. But the public, the public score that they have is about 60%, and here it goes to 80%. Of course, I have a very small sample size here, but
as far as statistics is concerned, a sample size of 30 is large enough.
Yeah. This was very quick. Sorry, but I, based on what the kind of questions and based on the kind of answers I'm seeing, I think it probably is actually closer to 80%. Or there's something I missed in the setup.
Yeah, so I think I think testing the bounds of obviously this is dependent on the data set, but explicitly baking into our process, we want to make sure that there's no bias in the data set towards a particular kind of grammatical structure or something like that. And so
I would hope that we should have some kind of metric of distinguishability or indistinguishability and rely on that. So if there's a significant difference in grammatical structure, then however that is distinguishability metric
we can use the blue, or however it's called, BLEU. That's currently what's used to tell the difference.
Yeah, maybe that's fine. I thought that one requires human subjective judgment.
I don't think so.
But I do think one potential concern is the fact that it does seem to generalize outside.
Well,
so maybe that it hasn't been gamed.
I mean, maybe maybe this is model dependent. For GPT-4, it does generalize, which is a good thing for GPT-4, and then Llama 2 does not generalize, for example.
So that's one thing we could definitely do, right? To test this on a few more models and see are they equally good or some of them seem to be cheating. The other option could be that instead you go this route. I was thinking if the results are actually positive, then that kind of demonstrates that you can kind of recreate the data sets from a few samples.
Yeah. How many bits do we need to recover it?
So then let's just to make it, I guess, as concrete as possible, because we've got 5 minutes before the office hours, and I think this is a good direction. Our next step is to figure out exactly what data set we want to try to create an alternate version for, right? So we want to create a data set that is going to be assessing the same thing as some already established data set, but is not the same question.
Do we want a question answering data set?
So I think it depends on exactly what we're looking for here. So we could also do fine tuning on, but it's just going to be very time consuming. So I think the best is something that has been out, so that we know that existing models may have been influenced by them, but we still have older models that we know are not influenced by them. So Bool Q and Truthful QA model data sets like that are perfect because they came after GPT-3. So I think that's.
But then effectively we're making our own version of that data set.
We're creating fictional held out samples of it. That's one track. The other track would be we are creating a similar data set that tries to measure the same capability and see how that compares to the one that was public. But but what you said is the first track,
Wait, sorry, what's the difference between these?
The other one is that here we are creating samples that are similar to a data set that is public. The other one is that we're creating a different data set on our own that tries to capture the same capability, right? So if we care about truthfulness, we will create our own truthfulness data set, and then seeing if those models having improved on another truthfulness data set also implies an improvement on our truthfulness data set.
Let's start with number one for now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I understand. So I feel like another critique here is just like, maybe this is obvious, right? From a machine learning perspective, like if you train these models in a good way, then you should get a good generalization. So maybe it's not surprising, something like that.
Mhm.
But I think a priori is not super obvious. But okay. So yeah, so we create held out data sets. We need to figure out how to define indistinguishable. Maybe we want to calibrate our data set. So similar score on a GPT-3 as the original. This is technically optional, but I think it makes it stronger. So we kind of select a subset that has the same overall score. Then measure gaps for old vs new model on public data sets. Measure gaps for old versus new on created data sets. I think that's all, or did I forget?
I mean, synthesize, analyze, and synthesize to give report values. Whatever. Cool. So I guess then the questions that I'm thinking are most valuable to like try to get answered are, what are some good data sets that have been published that people feel like are like, yes, this is actually assessing this thing as a base. And then the second thing would be, how do we define indistinguishable in the like of our questions from their questions?
I suspect we won't have an answer to that. I think it's a bit unusual, but I feel like if we Google it, we can probably find some standard.
Yeah, I'm not saying that we'll get like perfect responses, but just understanding what the ideal case scenario is going into it is valuable. Does anyone have any questions or anything they want to say?
Good for now.
Sweet.
I don't know, Ramb, how are we doing? What are you thinking?
I'm a little bit confused, honestly. But I think I I might hear you pitch again at the office hours, and I might get a better grip on it. So yeah.
So you can
Okay.
read this, but yeah, maybe ask a question and then maybe we can answer it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so please read this, but maybe I can just sort of, again, briefly explain it to you because it will be easier for you for the discussion.
Okay, fair enough.
So our goal is, again, to show that these data sets can be gamed. The hope here is that we evaluate if they are gamed, I guess, a bit more accidentally, right? Rather than a company going, we are going to, get around your eval whether you like it or not. They might, because there's data leakage or, people internally push a bit for it, whatever, right? So this is not as conscious of gaming, but that there's still some kind of gaming going on. So the point here is to see if are there some improvements on these data sets, for example, truthfulness, and that doesn't actually imply that these models have improved on that thing that we heard about. That would be the intention here, to sort of evaluate if that's the case or not.
What do we mean when we say gains on public data sets?
So an example would be like truthful QA, right? Where companies want it to score well on truthful QA,
Yeah.
because it sort of implies that the model is, either not lying to you, at least knows what it's talking about and so on. And we can see that it has improved a lot. GPT-3 is also around here. So it has improved like from 21% for GPT-3 to now 59, at least, is the one that they released. So the question is like, does this mean that now the model is actually more truthful or not? So how much of this improvement is an improvement on the actual capability that we've heard about or want? And how much of this is it just getting better because now we have a public data set?
As in, it encountered the data set in its training set, and it learned off of it, something like that.
Yeah, so that would be like the most obvious form of data leakage. But you can also have, for example, that engineers look at where it goes wrong and find some ways to add features, or I mean, I guess you don't necessarily add features that you before, but maybe you find some ways of collecting kind of samples, right? If you're doing RLHF, maybe go out and collect samples that are more truthfulness related, and particularly maybe inspired a bit by truthful QA, right? So there might be other forms of data leakage that's a bit more implicit than just training on exactly the truthful QA data set. But it could also be that you have seen this in your training data.
Okay, like how do we even test for this? As in, how do you evaluate a model to know if it has come across the database in its data set?
So there are ways where you can test that. For example, if you have a known public data set and you give them, say, you give them a prefix of one of the questions, you can see, does this model complete the question? Right? If you're taking a question that shouldn't be, that expected, and it answers exactly as in the data set, then you know that something fishy is going on. That's one way that people can test if there's been data leakage that's more explicit.
Using this kind of thought process, Shi et al. Introduced min-k% probability as a new detection method for identifying when content was present in training data in the paper Detecting Pre-Training Data from Large Language Models, which was published in October of 2023, approximately 1 month before this episode was recorded.
But the more general way that we're looking at this is that we are going to try to create what could have been the hidden data set for this public data set, right? Because it's normal in machine learning to do held out validation, right? So say you have your data set, you train on 80% of it, and 20% of it you're hiding from the model.
Cross-validation.
So we want to do that, but the problem is we don't have that hidden data set. So we're going to create the hidden data set. So that's the approach here. We're going to create that hidden data set and argue that we can create this in such a way that it's actually indistinguishable from the public data set. So now we have the held out data set, and we're going to evaluate if we are seeing the same improvements.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Following this conversation, we hopped into that office hours call that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, but it wasn't recorded. Fortunately for you all, though, our group did meet up again after that, which will make up the content for the next episode in the Hackathon subseries. Some of you may notice that I have a new logo. That's right, the show is well enough established now that I figured it would be worth doing some actual branding. Also, I had originally used an AI image generator for the album art since it was a quick way to get a decent looking image, but I always had planned to contract an actual real human artist for the logo and hopefully for some fun album art in the future as well. The logo was designed by Stellaric, who is a designer, developer, and broadcast producer, and it was a pleasure to work with them. If you like the logo and you need one yourself, consider working with them. Their website and Twitter are linked in the show notes. In the spirit of keeping this outro short, I will just quickly ask again for you to share the podcast with others that you think could benefit from it, or who would just enjoy me talking about machine learning related topics. I have been super busy recently, working to set up the next few episodes, and I'm really excited to share them with you all. Well, see you next time.